Dear students, in the present class, we will discuss classical theory of interest rate determination. Classical theory of interest rate provided a mechanism in the classical model denying the possibility that there would be deficiency of aggregate spending that results in unemployment and idle capacity. That is, interest rate is the variable which ensures equality between aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Classical economists agreed that specific goods and services may be overproduced relative to consumer demands. But they claimed that rapid market adjustments ensures that there never be a generalized glut, there never be a generalized overproduction of any commodity. And the denial that there will never be a general overproduction is known as Say's law of markets, something which we have extensively discussed, which states that supply creates its own demand. The logic of Say's law is that by supplying goods and services, producers are signaling a desire to exchange their output supplied by others in the market. So whenever something is produced and offered for sale in the market, it is with the desire to purchase some other goods and services. And no one will produce goods and services unless it is absolutely necessary to him, because work is a bad commodity, as we have discussed earlier. Now, in order to explain the role of interest rate to ensure that aggregate supply is always equal to aggregate demand, we assume that there is a closed economy with no government. We assume closed economy with no government. So in equilibrium, total spending is equal to total GDP, total supply GDP. So total spending consists of consumption spending and investment spending. That is, total spending consists of desired consumption expenditure and desired investment expenditure. And national income is either consumed or saved. C plus S. National income is either consumed or saved. This is aggregate demand, this is aggregate supply, and in equilibrium, C plus I is equal to C plus S. Aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply, which states that in equilibrium, S is equal to I. S is equal to desired or planned investment. Desired or planned investments. Now, classical economists assumed that withheld consumption is always matched by investment spending. Withheld consumption, that is saving, is always matched by desired investment or investment spending, given that saving is a signal to the producer that consumers wish to consume more in the future. So saving is a signal to the producer that he will consume more in the future. So firms are assumed to invest in future productive capacity so that they will be able to meet this postponed consumption in future. So whenever consumers save more, it is a signal to the producer that they will consume more in the future. So what happens is, if the consumers save more, producers will invest more to meet future increased demand, so that saving will always be equal to desired investment. To explain this process, suppose that initially economy is in equilibrium. Saving is equal to desired investment. Economy is initially in equilibrium. And also assume that there is a rise in desired savings. Assume that there is an increase in desired saving. Then what happens is, consumption spending will decline at present. Consumption spending will decline in the current period, and to maintain equilibrium, investment must increase. If there is an increase in desired savings, consumption spending will decline, so there will be an increase in desired investments, which must be equal to increase in desired savings. Now, ignoring the fact that how a real economy shift from production of consumer goods to investment goods, if consumption spending decreases, investment spending must increase. That is, economy must shift from the production of consumer goods to investment goods. And this is a complicated process. We do not know how or whether an economy can quickly convert production of consumption goods into production of investment goods. So we ignore this issue for the time being. Now, ignoring this issue, the theory of loanable funds claimed that there will be continuous equilibrium. Classical theory, also known as loanable fund theory of interest. Classical theory of interest, also known as loanable fund theory, claimed that continuous equilibrium is possible by interest rate adjustments, where there will be equality between planned savings or actual savings and planned investments. So the loanable fund theory, that is the classical theory of investment, claimed that interest rate will adjust quickly to ensure that there is always equilibrium. Now, the loanable funds market is really a primitive depiction of a financial system. It is the primitive. In order to explain the loanable fund theory, we have to explain what is the loanable fund market. It is the depiction of a primitive financial market where interest rate R is the price that ensures that planned saving is always equal to planned investment in any period. Planned saving is equal to planned investment in any period, and the interest rate is determined in the loanable funds market. In the loanable funds market, there are two groups of people. One, the savers or the lenders of loanable funds. The savers or the lenders of the loanable funds. The savers, the lenders, enter the loanable fund market seeking a return on their savings so that they can enhance their future consumption possibilities. And the firms enters the loanable funds market seeking to invest, seeking money for making investments. So two forces, the savers, the lenders, we can say the buyers, the firms. Here the incentive is interest, which will enhance future consumption. Here it is fund for investment. And interest rate is determined in the market by the operation of the forces of demand and supply, and this interest rate is returned to the households for their savings, and it is the cost of borrowing for the firms. And equilibrium rate of interest in the classical theory is the rate at which the amount of funds that the lenders desire to lend is equal to the amount of funds the firms, the buyers desire to borrow. Equilibrium rate of interest is determined where the desire to lend is equal to the desire to borrow. Now we assume that borrowing consists of selling a standard bond, and lending consists of buying of the bond. Firms borrow money by selling bonds, and sellers, savers, lenders buy these bonds, and the rate of interest is the return on holding the bonds, or it is the cost of borrowing. It is the return of holding the bonds. We will study the features of bonds in a future class. And the cost of borrowing, the return on borrowing depends on the level of bond supply and also the level of bond demand. It is determined by supply and demand for bonds. And in the classical system, the suppliers of bonds are firms who finance their investments by selling bonds. That is, one is firms, the second one is government. Government also sell bonds to finance expenditure in excess of revenue. And in the original system, in the original classical system, there is no government. So government can spend more by selling bonds. Government can also finance its expenditure by printing currency also. That will increase the supply of money, and the consequences will be considered later. And it is assumed that the level of government deficit is excess of spending over revenue plus the portion of deficit which the government is planning to fill by selling bonds to the public, and it is assumed that these factors are exogenous policy variables, that is, excess of spending over revenue and the part of this excess to be financed by bonds. These two are exogenous policy variables. And in the classical model, and we assume in our future analysis that there is no government. Our analysis is not affected even if we will not include government, or whether we include government or not. In the classical model, the level of investment by the business sector is a function of expected profitability and rate of interest. Expected profitability depends on the expectation about future demand for the product, and the state of expectations is subject to exogenous shifts. And for a given expectations, investments vary inversely with the rate of interest. So, investment depends on expectations and R. If we assume that expectations is constant, investment is negatively related to the rate of interest. The reason is, at a higher rate of interest, only a few investment projects will be profitable, and at a low interest rate, more investment projects will be profitable. So, at a high rate of interest, investment will be low. At a low rate of interest, investment will be high. And on supply side of the market, government bond supply is exogenous. It is a policy variable, we will not consider that. And business supply of bond by government and business firms, and business firms supply depend by investment expenditure. And investment varies inversely with the rate of interest, and is also influenced by exogenous shift in the profitability of investment projects. On the demand side of the bond market, bonds are demanded by individual savers who purchase bonds. And in the classical model, saving is a positive function of interest rate, because as the rate of interest increases, what happens is command over goods and services in the future will increase. So, individuals, households will save more. So, as R increases, we expect that saving will increase. So, from the supply side of bonds, or from the point of view of investors, investment is negatively related to interest rate. For the sellers of bonds, for the buyers of bonds, the supply of bonds, the demand for bonds is positively related. Now let us see these arguments in the form of a graph. On the y-axis we take the rate of interest, on the x-axis saving and investment, and supply of loanable funds. Loanable funds are supplied by individuals, households, positively related to rate of interest. Demand for loanable funds negatively related to, or investment is negatively related to So S is supply, saving is positively related to interest rate, and it is the supply of loanable funds. Investment is negatively related to interest rates, and total demand for loanable funds is determined by investment plus exogenously determined government deficit. Government deficit is G minus T. If G is greater than T, this is positive, otherwise negative. If G is equal to T, budget is balanced. So I plus G minus T, and this is the equilibrium rate of interest R0, and this is the point where S is equal to I plus G minus T. I plus G minus T. So equilibrium is determined by equality between supply of loanable funds and demand for loanable funds. And the rate of interest in the classical system is assumed to adjust to ensure that supply is always equal to demand. If R is less than R0, then demand for loanable funds exceeds supply of loanable funds, and the competition among borrowers push up the rate of interest. And if R is greater than R0, the opposite will happen. Now, given that the equilibrium rate of interest is determined by the supply of loanable funds and the demand for loanable funds, let us see the impact on R. We consider the impact on R if the households suddenly decides to consume more. Suppose that supply of loanable funds, demand for loanable funds, I, assuming that there is no government, S is equal to Y, R is equal to R0. We assume that there is no government, or simply that G is equal to T, government budget is balanced. At R is equal to R0, so as a result, if as a result of households' decision to consume more, what happens is at this S shifts to S1. S shift to S1. And as you can see at R0, excess demand equal to AB, or supply of loanable fund is less than demand for loanable funds. Now, as a result, what happens is interest rate will increase from R0 to R1. S is again equal to I. Interest rate will increase. Now remember this, real GDP will not be affected because real GDP is determined by market equilibrium. Composition of output changes rather than the totals. As you can see, when the households decide to save more, consumption decreases, so investment also decreases. Consumption decreases, consumption decreases, so what happens is, initially, yes, consume more, so saving, initially R0 and S is equal to Y, then households decide to consume more, supply schedule shifted to S1. And new equilibrium is at R1 S is equal to Y. Now, saving is reduced. That means saving is reduced means and consumption increases, investment contracts. Sorry, lower saving is offset by higher consumption and investment contracts. So what happens is, if the households decide to consume more, demand for investment decreases or saving decreases. Equilibrium will not be affected. What we say is the composition of output will change. Production of consumer goods increases, production of investment goods decreases. So in the classical system, R is a real variable. R is a real variable which adjusts to bring about aggregate equality between aggregate supply and aggregate demand via the loanable funds market. So the entire real side of the system is explained without a reference to money. So real GDP, national income, employment, real income, interest rates are all determined in the real side of the economy without a reference to money. That is, all these variables can be determined, explained in the classical system without a reference to money. The effect of money as per the quantity theory is only on price level. It cannot affect the values of any of the real variables. As we have seen here, if the consumers decide to consume more, saving will decrease. When saving decreases, what happens is investment will decrease. That is, production of investment goods will decrease, production of consumer goods will increase to meet increased demand for consumption. So there will be a change in the composition of output, and this is ensured by interest rate adjustments. At a higher rate of interest, saving will be low, investment will also be low, composition of output is not affected. So rate of interest ensures that aggregate supply is equal to aggregate demand always in the classical system. There will be no deficiency of demand. Whatever is produced is automatically consumed, and economy will always operate at full employment. These are the basic results which we obtain in the classical system.